Hi everybody, today we are going to review the anatomy of brain, eye and ear for an introductory anatomy and physiology course. So go ahead and get started with the main lobes of the brain. The brain has five main lobes, four of them are visible on this view. So we have the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe, we have the occipital lobe. On the side, we have the temporal lobe. And if you move the lateral sulcus, which is the line you see right here, and look underneath that, you will observe the last part of the cerebral cortex, which is referred to as insula. On the posterior inferior aspect of the brain, we have a separate structure called the cerebellum. Now, when you look at your separation from the frontal lobe to the parietal lobe, we have one main groove, which is the line you see right here, representing the central sulcus. And the pattern or region right immediately in front of the central sulcus is referred to as the precentral gyrus, which is part of the frontal lobe. And the region right immediately after the central sulcus is called postcentral gyrus, which is associated with your parietal lobe. Looking from the superior view of the brain, we can see the main fissure, which is basically a deep sulcus, dividing the brain to two halves, right and left cerebral hemispheres. And again, you can see from this view the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe in the back. And the line that is separating the brain to the two hemispheres is called the longitudinal fissure. Now, if we open up the brain and look at some of the internal structures of the brain, what we will observe is include the part of the diencephalon, which is thalamus, and right here, this oval structure right at the center. Right below this triangular structure right below it is hypothalamus. And again, think about the word hypo. Hypo means below thalamus. So basically, this is a structure sitting below the thalamus. Hanging off of the hypothalamus, which basically is part of the endocrine system, you have the gland called the pituitary gland. In reality, this gland has two parts, anterior and posterior, which are responsible for production of a significant number of hormones that are basically essential for our survival. Right where the hypothalamus is located, what you have coming in is the optic nerve. So imagine if you were looking at the brain and the eyes, your eyes would be sitting right here. So the optic nerve is the nerve that basically collects the data from your eye for your sense of vision. It comes running right here, creating the optic nerve. And then this region you see right here, if you actually look at it from underneath the brain, it is the area where the two nerves are crossing, basically the concept of contralateral, when the nerve on the right eye gets sent to the left part of the brain or the left hemisphere, and the signal from the left eye gets sent down to the right hemisphere. So if you guys kind of imagine the how it would look like, basically here are my eyes. Here is basically my eyes. Again, coming out of the back of the eye, you have your optic nerve. So here are your optic nerves. And this point where the crisscrossing happening, again, data from the right going to the left and from the left going to the right, that crisscrossing happens. That area is what we identify as the optic chiasm or optic chiasma. This is again where the crisscrossing takes place. Now, if I'm looking at the brain, just kind of orienting yourself, it's a good idea. We have the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. The frontal part of is called the frontal lobe, what we have already looked at. This region, if I'm asking you specifically for the lobe, would be the parietal lobe. And farthest in the back would be your occipital lobe. Again, in the posterior inferior aspect of the brain, we have your cerebellum. And this structure you see right here as a whole It's called corpus callosum. It is a way for the two hemispheres of the brain to communicate. These are basically made up of this structure. This corpus callosum is made up of nerve bridges that extend from the right hemisphere of the brain to the left hemisphere, allowing these two hemispheres to basically work with each other and allow you to carry out and collect sensory data. Going down right here, right underneath your diencephalon, which is thalamus and hypothalamus, you have your brainstem. Brainstem has three main parts. The superior part is midbrain. This piece that is kind of bulging out is your pons, and the extension of that is medulla oblongata. In the right below the corpus callosum, in the posterior aspect, we also have a structure called pineal body or pineal gland. This is technically part of the diencephalon. And if you wonder what is the function of the pineal body, it produces a hormone called melatonin, which is basically puts you to sleep, simply put. But please do know that the hormone melatonin that is released by the pineal body is controlled by the hypothalamus. So basically, you won't be able to release this hormone until the hypothalamus tells the pineal body you can release the hormone. Now moving to your eye, so when you look at the eye, we have 6 extrinsic muscles. These are the muscles that are connected to the white of the eye or your sclera, and basically gives you the rotation or the movement associated with your eyes. Now 4 of these muscles are pretty easy because they literally are positioned in a 90-degree angle from one another. They're identified as rectus muscles. The one on the top is superior rectus. The one on the bottom is inferior rectus. The one toward your nose or closest to your nose is your medial rectus. And the one farthest away, close to your temples, basically, is your lateral rectus. Now, on the models, how can I tell which one is the medial, which one is lateral? You look at the positioning of this muscle on the top. So see how this muscle kind of have that curvature? This is the ligament of a muscle called the superior oblique. And the angle of this is always points toward the medial aspect of the eye. So if this muscle was here on this side, this would be the medial aspect. But because it's now on the left-hand side, this is the medial aspect. Now you have the superior oblique, and then you have another oblique muscle on the bottom, and this one, which is number 3, is identified as inferior oblique. When you look at the eye model, actually, again, looking at some of the muscle terminology, here is, again, try to say it with me if you can. This is your superior rectus. This is your superior oblique, pointing in that direction, making this one your medial rectus. What you see right here in the bottom would be your inferior rectus. Pointing right on the side is your inferior oblique. And this one right here would be your lateral rectus. Now, the outer layer of the eye is the protective layer made up of the sclera, which is the white of the eye. And then you have this shiny covering right on top of that, which is the continuation of the sclera, and that's called the cornea. Underneath the cornea, you can visualize your iris, which is the color portion of the eye. And at the center of the iris, you have an opening called the pupil. If I go ahead and remove the sclera, which is the outermost layer of the eye, we have the second layer of the eye, which is called the vascular tunic. Now, vascular tunic appear as a very dark color. This is referred to as the choroid layer. If you guys remember from your lectures, the reason it is dark is because it contains melanin, which basically absorbs any extra light that comes into the eye and prevents the reflection of these eyes inside the orbital or inside your eye, basically. That may affect the creation of vision. Now, if I go ahead and remove the choroid layer, which is the second layer, What I will have inside of this is this really open large cavity, which is called the posterior cavity. Again, if you recall from your lecture, this cavity is filled with a gelatinous solution called the vitreous humor, and it helps maintain the shape of your eye. Coming out of the back of the eye, you have your optic nerve, which we also talked about in terms of your brain. This is the one that comes out of the back of the eye and eventually ends in the occipital lobe. You have a shiny, clear structure on the anterior aspect of the eye, which is basically your lens that allows you to focus on the objects. Now, the deepest, the third layer of the eye is the sensory tunic or sensory layer, also known as the retina. So this inner lining that you see right here is your retina, and what you see as this red coloring on the outside of that, that's your choroid layer. Even though I didn't label it, this layer you see in red is the same as you see here in kind of a black color. This is the same layer, just a different view. Now, within the retina, a couple of the structures that are visible is where the optic nerve comes out of the eye. That's called the optic disc. So what you identify as number 14 right here is your optic disc. The area immediately below that is where you will have a significant number of photoreceptors. That's going to give you the best image. That's called fovea centralis. And again, the extension that comes out of the back of the eye is called the optic nerve. You already identified the lens that sits on the anterior aspect of the eye. By the way, if I'm looking at this picture, again, this central opening right here, that's where the light comes in and hits the lens. That's the pupil. And this region right here and this region right here would be your iris, basically the color portion of the eye, which is depicted on the earlier picture, depicted as right here. The last part of our lecture is on the ear model, so your sense of hearing. First thing you need to understand is that your ear is divided to three parts: the external ear, the middle ear, and the inner or internal ear. The external ear is made up of pinna, and the channel that basically allows the vibration of the sound to be transferred into your ear, called the external acoustic meatus, or auditory canal for simplicity. The end of the external acoustic meatus, you have this kind of a flattened structure or flattened funnel structure. That's the tympanic membrane, which in layman's term called eardrum. But please don't use that in your exam. I'm just kind of helping you identify structures here. Now, if you take a look at the middle ear, which is this structure right here, if you kind of zoom into that, what you have is the tympanic membrane right here, and the three bones that forms your middle ear. The one that is directly attached to your tympanic membrane, which is what you see here, is referred to as the malleus. In your model, it is separated from the second bone of your your middle ear, called incus. So this is your incus, and this is your malleus, and this is the separation. Incus is connected to the third bone of the middle ear, which is actually in our models is attached to your inner ear as this structure. Kind of looks like a stirrup, and it's referred to as the stapes. So if I ask you guys to name the bones of the middle ear, your answer should be in order: malleus, incus, and stapes. Together, they refer to as ossicles. The inner ear is made up of three separate structures. These half circle, there are three of them, called semicircular canals. This midsection or the body, which is called vestibule, and the snail shell that is called the cochlea. If you guys remember, cochlea is the part that basically converts the vibration of the sounds to electrical impulses. And last, what you see in the yellow structure is a combination of two nerves, one coming from the cochlea and one coming from your vestibule. So the nerve as a whole is called vestibulocochlear nerve. We're going to take a brief look at the sheep's brain anatomy. Again, we didn't really get a chance to dissect it, but if you guys look at your module, you also have a link to a video of a sheep brain dissection. So again, here is basically what a sheep brain looks like. It is relatively small, but again, very visible structures in terms of, for instance, longitudinal fissure that gives you the two hemispheres of the brain. You have the internal structures of the brain, starting with your brain stem. So right here is your midbrain. Again, the bulging region right here, what you see is your pons, and the extension of that would be medulla oblongata. In this picture, anything that is farther below that is the spinal cord. So this section is the spinal cord. Now looking at the other structures, you have this line right here, that's the corpus callosum. So this section right here is corpus callosum, which again was the nerve bridge between your two hemispheres. This section right here would be your thalamus, and the area right below that would be your hypothalamus. Right here is the area where, again, the optic nerve crisscrosses, called the optic chiasma, which basically makes this extension right here your optic nerve. I don't know if I labeled it, so I'm just going to label it right here for you guys. Again, this whole section on the superior part of the brain is called your cerebrum. The posterior aspect of the brain, you have your cerebellum, and also, as I mentioned, the continuation of your brain stem, which is right here, it would be your spinal cord. Identification of the main lobes, again, similar to human. You have the occipital lobe closer to the cerebellum, parietal lobe more on the superior, and then the frontal lobe on the anterior aspect of the brain. So that's about it for our special senses and our brain anatomy. And we'll make sure you guys are logged into your Canvas and complete the lab assignment for this video.